What you're about to witness will restore your faith in the bonds that war creates and time cannot break. This is the story of how 20 seconds of recognition between two soldiers proved that some connections transcend protocol, rank, and even the passage of decades. Colonel James Macready had not planned to visit Buckingham Palace that Tuesday morning. At 73, his days of tourist attractions and sightseeing were long behind him. But his granddaughter Emma had insisted, and saying no to an 8-year-old who reminded him so much of his late wife was impossible. So here he stood, his weathered hands gripping a walking stick that had become more necessity than accessory, watching the pageantry of the changing of the guard with eyes that had seen too much history to be impressed by ceremony. The autumn morning was crisp, and Macready pulled his worn military jacket tighter around his shoulders. It wasn't his dress uniform. That was hanging in a closet back home in Yorkshire, pressed and ready for the funeral he hoped wouldn't come for another decade. This was his old field jacket, faded and patched, but still bearing the insignia of the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment. Still carrying the weight of memories from mountains in Afghanistan where boys became men and men learned the true cost of freedom. Emma tugged at his sleeve, pointing excitedly at the guards taking their positions. "Grandpa, look how tall they are. Look how still they stand. Are they real people or statues?" Macready smiled despite himself. "They're real, sweetheart, very real. They're soldiers, just like your grandfather used to be." But as his eyes moved across the line of guards, something made him stop. Something about the way one of them held his rifle, the precise angle of his shoulders, the particular way he kept his chin level while his eyes scanned the crowd. Macready had trained enough soldiers in his 30-year career to recognize the subtle signatures of training, the individual variations that survived standardization. And this guard, this tall, blond young man with the pale blue eyes, and the absolute stillness of professional discipline, this guard held himself in a way that sparked something deep in Macready's memory. The recognition came slowly, like dawn breaking over distant hills. Not immediate, not certain, but growing stronger with each passing second. Those shoulders had carried a different pack once. That rifle had been held at a different angle, in a different uniform, under a different flag, but the man holding them. Thompson. Macready whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer answered after decades of silence. The guard's eyes, which had been methodically scanning the crowd with professional detachment, suddenly stopped. Not his head, not his posture, but his gaze locked onto the old man standing 40 feet away. And in that instant, 20 years melted away like snow in spring sunshine. Private David Thompson, 19 years old, scared out of his mind, but trying not to show it. Standing at attention while Colonel Macready briefed the squad before their first patrol in the Helmand province. His uniform too big, his confidence too small, his determination absolute despite his fear. The same eyes. The same way of holding his chin when he was fighting to maintain composure. The same microscopic tells that revealed the human being beneath the military bearing. Macready's walking stick trembled in his grip as memories flooded back with the force of an avalanche. The patrol that had gone wrong, the eye that had turned their transport into twisted metal and smoke. The 3 hours pinned down by sniper fire while rescue struggled to reach them. And Thompson, Private Thompson, crawling through rifle fire to drag Sergeant Walsh to safety while Macready provided covering fire with a dislocated shoulder and blood in his eyes. The medal ceremony 6 months later, Thompson standing at attention while Macready pinned the military cross to his chest for gallantry under fire. The young man's voice, barely controlled, saying just doing my job, sir, in that particular Yorkshire accent that had reminded Macready of his own father. Grandpa. Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. Grandpa, are you crying? Macready realized that he was. Tears were running down his withered cheeks, cutting paths through lines earned by decades of service and sacrifice. But these weren't tears of sadness. These were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of the particular joy that comes when the universe reveals that good men survive and thrive and continue to serve with honor. The guard, Thompson, maintained his position with perfect discipline. But something had changed in his stillness. What had been routine vigilance was now active recognition. His breathing had deepened almost imperceptibly. His grip on his rifle had shifted by fractions of an inch. The signs were subtle, nearly invisible to anyone who hadn't trained with him, served with him, bled with him in mountains half a world away. Around them, the ceremony continued with clockwork precision. Other guards moved through their routines with ceremonial perfection. Tourists snapped photographs and spoke in hushed tones about tradition and pageantry. The morning proceeded according to schedule, marked by centuries of protocol and procedure. But between two soldiers separated by 40 feet and 20 years, something else was happening. A conversation conducted entirely in silence, in the language of shared experience that transcends words. Recognition flowing both ways across a gap that might as well have been continents. Macready straightened his shoulders, muscle memory overriding arthritis and age. Without conscious thought, his free hand moved to his temple in a salute that was perfect in its precision, flawless in its respect. Not the casual acknowledgement of civilian to serviceman, but the formal recognition of one soldier honoring another. The salute of a commanding officer who remembered every name, every face, every act of courage under his command. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, Thompson's eyes held his former colonel's gaze. And in that moment, the young soldier who had crawled through enemy fire to save a comrade's life looked out through the eyes of the royal guard who now stood watch over kings and queens. The response was so subtle that only Macready saw it. The slightest deepening of focus, the microscopic shift in posture that in military bearing served as acknowledgement of a salute received and recognized. Thompson couldn't break protocol, couldn't abandon his post, couldn't respond with anything that would compromise his duty, but he could remember, and in that remembering, he could let his old colonel know that the recognition was mutual, the respect unchanged, the bond forged in combat still strong enough to bridge decades and duty. Macready held his salute for exactly 3 seconds, regulation time for honoring a decorated soldier, then lowered his hand. The moment was over, but its impact would last forever. He had found one of his boys, one of the young men he had trained and led and worried about during the long nights when command meant lying awake wondering if his decisions would bring them all home alive. And this boy, this man, had not just survived, he had thrived. He had continued to serve with the same dedication and honor that had earned him recognition in the mountains of Afghanistan. He had found his way to one of the most prestigious military positions in the British Army, trusted to stand guard over the crown itself. The pride that filled Macready's chest was so powerful it was almost painful. This was what every commanding officer hoped for, to see his soldiers not just survive their service, but to see them grow into men and women worthy of the sacrifice that service demanded. Emma tugged at his sleeve again, her young voice cutting through the weight of memory and recognition. "Grandpa, why are you standing so straight? Why are you smiling like that?" Macready looked down at his granddaughter, then back at the guard who had once been his soldier. The young man who had proven that courage was the absence of fear, but action taken despite it. The veteran who had found a way to continue serving something greater than himself long after the wars ended. "Because, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion and pride, "I just remembered why I'm proud to have served my country." The changing of the guard ceremony continued around them, but Macready's attention had narrowed to that single figure in scarlet wool. 20 years had changed them both. Macready's hair had gone completely gray, his shoulders had bent under the weight of age and service, his hands carried the tremor of a man who had seen too much and given too much. But Thompson, his stance was stronger now, more confident, carrying the authority that comes only from years of proven service and earned respect. The crowd pressed closer for the ceremony's conclusion, but Macready found himself moving against the flow, drawing nearer to the guard post where Thompson stood. Not close enough to disrupt protocol or cause security concerns, but close enough to see the details that mattered. Close enough to read the story written in military bearing and professional pride. The young private from Afghanistan had grown into this. The scared boy who had volunteered for the most dangerous patrols had become the man trusted to stand guard over royalty. The soldier who had crawled through enemy fire had earned the right to wear the ceremonial uniform that represented centuries of British military tradition. Macready could see it all in the way Thompson held himself. The confidence that came from surviving real combat. The wisdom that came from facing death and choosing life, choosing service, choosing to continue standing guard over things worth protecting. This wasn't just ceremonial duty, this was a warrior's commitment to protecting what civilization held dear. "Can we get closer, Grandpa?" Emma whispered, tugging at his jacket sleeve. "I want to see if his eyes really don't move." Macready almost smiled despite the emotions churning in his chest. His eyes move, sweetheart. They see everything. That's what makes him good at his job. And it was true. Even maintaining his ceremonial stillness, Thompson's gaze was constantly scanning, evaluating, processing. Macready recognized the habit from their time in combat zones, the never-ending assessment of threats, the unconscious cataloging of every face in the crowd, the military alertness that never quite switched off even in peacetime. But as the ceremony wound down and the crowd began to disperse, something extraordinary happened. The formal changing of positions was complete. The new guards had assumed their posts, and protocol should have demanded that Thompson march away to the guardhouse with his relief. Instead, he remained at his post. Not breaking regulations, he was entitled to a few moments of transition time between shifts. Not abandoning his duty, another guard was positioned to maintain security coverage. But staying, for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with something deeper than protocol, Thompson's eyes found Macready's face in the thinning crowd, and this time there was no mistaking the recognition. No subtle acknowledgement or professional restraint. This was the look of a student finding his teacher, a soldier seeing his commanding officer, a man encountering the person who had shaped him during the most crucial moments of his life. Macready felt his breath catch as he realized what was happening. After 20 years of wondering what had become of his soldiers, after decades of hoping they had found peace and purpose and meaning beyond the mountains where they had served together, he was looking at living proof that the best of them had not just survived, but flourished. The old colonel began walking closer, his walking stick tapping against cobblestones with measured rhythm. Not rushing, military bearing never completely leaves a soldier, regardless of age or civilian status, but moving with purpose toward a conversation to decades in the making. "Grandpa," Emma's voice carried concern. "Where are we going?" "To say hello to an old friend," Macready replied, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Thompson watched his approach with the perfect stillness that was his trademark, but Macready could read the micro-expressions that military training never quite eliminated. The slight tightening around the eyes that indicated intense focus, the microscopic shift in breathing that suggested controlled excitement, the barely perceptible straightening of shoulders that was Thompson's way of coming to attention for an officer he had respected above all others. When Macready stopped just beyond the regulation distance that protocol demanded, the two soldiers looked at each other across 2 decades of separation. The silence between them was not empty but filled with shared memories, mutual respect, and the particular bond that forms between men who have faced death together and chosen to live with honor. Private Thompson, Macready said quietly, his voice carrying all the authority and affection of a commanding officer who had never forgotten the faces under his command. Colonel Macready, sir, came the reply, equally quiet, but carrying the unmistakable pride of a soldier acknowledging the man who had taught him what service really meant. The words were spoken so softly that Emma, standing right beside her grandfather, barely heard them. But they carried across that courtyard with the weight of artillery fire, announcing to anyone who understood military protocol that something unprecedented was happening. Thompson's response had been automatic, instinctive, the product of training so deep it had become part of his DNA, but it was also a choice, a decision to honor the relationship that had shaped him, regardless of the potential complications with current duty and protocol. At ease, Soldier, Macready said, using the phrase that had begun 1,000 conversations in 12 countries over 3 decades of military service. You've done well for yourself. The understatement was so profound it was almost comical. Thompson had done more than well. He had achieved something that less than 1% of British soldiers ever achieved. He had earned the right to wear the uniform that represented the pinnacle of military ceremony, the ultimate expression of a warrior's commitment to protecting what his nation held most sacred. "Thank you, sir," Thompson replied, and in those 3 words was contained 20 years of growth, struggle, achievement, and unshakable dedication to the principles Macready had taught him in the mountains of Afghanistan. Around them, tourists continued their sightseeing, largely unaware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A few phones were raised, recording what looked like a pleasant conversation between an elderly visitor and one of the famous guards. But they couldn't capture what was really happening, the completion of a circle, the proof that leadership and mentorship could echo across decades. "Your family?" Macready asked, his eyes moving briefly to the palace behind Thompson. "Are they well?" "Yes, sir. Wife and 2 daughters. The eldest wants to join the army." Pride colored Thompson's voice, the pride of a man whose service had been meaningful enough to inspire the next generation. Macready nodded, understanding flooding through him. The cycle would continue. The values he had tried to instill in young soldiers 20 years ago had taken root, grown strong, and would be passed on to new generations. This was how civilization perpetuated itself, one teacher, one student, one moment of courage inspiring the next. Emma tugged at Macready's jacket again, her patience finally exhausted by adult conversation she didn't understand. "Grandpa, can we go see the horses now?" The interruption broke the spell, reminding both men that this moment, however precious, existed within the constraints of duty and family and the normal flow of life. Thompson's shift was ending. Macready's granddaughter was waiting. The world would not pause indefinitely for their reunion. But as Macready prepared to say goodbye to his former soldier, Thompson did something that would remain etched in memory forever. Something that proved that some bonds transcend protocol, regulation, and even the passage of time. With perfect military precision, he rendered a salute. Not the casual acknowledgement that guards sometimes offered to distinguished visitors, but the full, formal salute that a soldier gives to his commanding officer. The salute that says, "You shaped me, you led me, you made me worthy of this uniform I wear." And Macready, despite his 73 years and his walking stick and his granddaughter pulling at his sleeve, returned that salute with all the pride and precision of his 30 years of service. To soldiers, separated by decades and duty, acknowledging that some lessons never fade and some connections never break. The salute held between them for exactly 3 seconds, regulation time that both men had learned decades ago and never forgotten. When their hands dropped simultaneously, something had been completed. Not just a greeting between old comrades, but an acknowledgement that the bonds forged in combat survive everything time can throw at them. Emma looked up at both men with the wide-eyed confusion of childhood trying to understand adult emotions. "Grandpa, why are you both standing so straight? And why do you look like you're about to cry again?" Macready knelt down beside his granddaughter, his arthritis protesting, but his heart too full to remain standing at attention. Because sometimes, sweetheart, you meet someone who reminds you why you chose to spend your life serving your country. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that the young people you tried to help became even better than you hoped they would. Thompson remained at perfect attention, but something in his expression had softened. This wasn't the ceremonial mask of the Royal Guard anymore. This was David Thompson, the young soldier who had written letters home to his mother about the colonel who had taught him that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about being scared and doing your duty anyway. Your mother, Macready said, rising slowly with the help of his walking stick. How is she? Is she still in Yorkshire? She passed 2 years ago, sir, Thompson replied quietly. But she never stopped talking about the letter you sent after the medal ceremony, she framed it. It hung in her kitchen until the day she died. The words hit Macready with unexpected force. He remembered that letter, remembered staying up late in his quarters trying to find the right words to tell a mother that her son was a hero. That his courage had saved lives, that she should be proud of the man she had raised. She raised a good soldier, Macready said, his voice thick with emotion. She raised a man who understood what service really means. Around them, the morning crowd continued to flow past, tourists moving on to their next destination, families heading toward other attractions. But in this small pocket of space outside Buckingham Palace, 2 generations of British military tradition stood connected by something stronger than time or circumstance. Thompson's radio crackled softly, a reminder that his relief period was ending, that duty called him back to the guardhouse for debriefing and the end of his shift. But before he could respond to the summons, Emma spoke up with the perfect timing that only children possess. "Are you friends?" she asked, looking between her grandfather and the tall guard with the innocent directness that cuts through all adult complexity. "Yes, sweetheart," Macready replied, never taking his eyes off Thompson's face. "We're friends. The kind of friends you make when you're young and never forget, no matter how old you get." Thompson's response came with the precise diction of military bearing, but colored with warmth that had nothing to do with regulation or protocol. "The colonel taught me what it means to be a soldier, miss. He taught all of us that serving your country means serving something bigger than yourself." It was the longest speech Thompson had made in public since taking his post, a breach of the usual silence that surrounded Royal Guard duty. But it was also something else, a testament, delivered in front of witnesses, about the kind of leader Macready had been and the lasting impact of his service. Emma nodded solemnly as if she understood perfectly. "Grandpa says soldiers protect people. Is that what you do?" "That's exactly what I do," Thompson confirmed, and Macready heard in his voice the same quiet conviction that had carried him through combat patrols in Afghanistan, through the long training that had earned him this posting, through 20 years of continued service to ideals larger than personal ambition. The radio crackled again, more insistent this time. Thompson's break was officially over. Protocol demanded his return to duty, his transition from this extraordinary moment back to the routine of military life. But before he could respond, Macready spoke one final time. "Private Thompson," he said, using the rank that would always define their relationship regardless of current positions or passing years. "I want you to know that everything we hoped for you has come true. Every lesson we tried to teach, every example we tried to set, you've honored all of it. You've become the kind of soldier that makes command worthwhile." Thompson's response came in the form of another salute, this one held just a fraction longer than regulation required. But when he lowered his hand, his voice carried words that Macready would treasure for whatever years remained to him. "Thank you, sir, for everything. For teaching me that duty isn't about following orders. It's about being worthy of the trust people place in you." Then, with the precision that had defined his military career from Afghanistan to London, Thompson executed a perfect about-face and began his march back to the guardhouse. His steps were measured, his bearing flawless, his transition from personal moment back to professional duty seamless and complete. Macready watched until Thompson disappeared through the palace gates, then stood for another long moment absorbing what had just happened. In a world where leadership was often measured by quarterly results or political victories, he had been reminded that true leadership is measured by the people. It shapes the lives it touches, the values it passes on to future generations. "Grandpa," Emma said, tugging at his sleeve with renewed energy, "can we go see the horses now?" "You promised." Macready smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features with genuine joy. "Yes, sweetheart, we can go see the horses. But first, let me tell you a story about a young soldier who became one of the bravest men I ever knew." As they walked away from Buckingham Palace, Macready began to speak about courage and duty and the kind of leadership that measures success not in personal achievement, but in the achievements of those we have the privilege to guide. Emma listened with the rapt attention of childhood, absorbing lessons about service and sacrifice that would shape her own understanding of what it means to contribute something meaningful to the world. Behind them, within the palace walls, Thompson completed his shift debrief with perfect professionalism. He answered questions about crowd control and security observations with the detailed precision expected of Royal Guard personnel. But in his heart, he carried something else, the renewed understanding that his service was part of a continuum, a chain of duty and honor that stretched back through generations and would continue long after his own watch ended. That evening, alone in his quarters, Thompson sat down to write a letter. Not an official report or military correspondence, but a personal message to his wife, telling her about the unexpected encounter with the officer who had shaped his understanding of what it meant to serve. The man who had taught him that true strength comes not from what you can do, but from what you choose to do when no one is watching. Meanwhile, in a hotel room overlooking the Thames, Macready tucked Emma into bed and answered her questions about soldiers and service and why some people choose to spend their lives protecting others. Her innocent queries helped him articulate truths he had carried for decades, but rarely had the opportunity to explain. "Will I see the soldier again?" she asked as sleep began to claim her. "I don't know, sweetheart," Macready replied honestly. "But even if we don't, what matters is that we know he's there, standing guard, keeping us safe, honoring the promises that soldiers make when they put on the uniform." As Emma drifted off to sleep, Macready sat by the window looking out at the lights of London, thinking about the young men and women he had trained over 3 decades of military service. Wondering which of them had found their way to meaningful lives, which had discovered that the lessons learned in combat could guide them through the challenges of peace. But tonight, he knew the answer for at least one of them. Tonight, he had proof that leadership matters, that mentorship endures, that the values taught in the crucible of military service can sustain a person for decades of continued commitment to something greater than themselves. In the morning, he would take Emma to see the horses as promised. They would visit other attractions, make other memories, continue their grandfather-granddaughter adventure through London. But this moment, this recognition between two soldiers separated by decades but united by shared purpose, this would remain with him forever. The reminder that in a world often obsessed with individual achievement and personal advancement, some people still choose service, still stand guard, still honor the promise that civilization will be protected by those willing to dedicate their lives to something larger than themselves. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you get to see that the young people you tried to guide have grown into exactly the kind of leaders the world needs most. The chain of service continues, one soldier at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one act of courage inspiring the next.